In the last video, we got the long block assembled with the exhaust manifold. Also got the backing plate assembled. We have a new coil, new condenser. We're reusing the old points. I just dressed up the contacts and they look really good. We also put new spark plug wires on it with the grommets. Went ahead and painted the back and then polished this area with the maker's information on it. I think that looks pretty nice. So we are ready to move forward with the rest of the assembly. So I guess what we'll do next is get the top plate mounted to the engine itself. And we'll also make sure that the gears mesh over here with the foot pedal and the gear on the crankshaft. Alright, so there's two bolts that mount the engine to this top plate. I'll show you that in just a minute. They go in from the bottom. So even when they're in, of course not all the way tight, you can move the motor side to side like this just a little bit. So you have to get it lined up with these gears before you cinch those bolts down. So for example, if it's too far this way, the gears aren't going to engage completely. And then on the other extreme, if it's cocked to the right too far, the gears will bind up. So you have to find a happy medium in the middle where the gears mesh nicely. All right, if you remember from the last video, this little brass plug here is actually part of the carburetor venturi. That's where the fuel gets pulled up from the fuel tank through that tiny little hole up into the combustion chambers. So when I put the sealant on, you don't want it really anywhere near this hole. You don't want any to be squished out and down into that hole because that would prevent the flow of the fuel and your engine won't run. So this hole here is just a bolt hole, so we don't have to be worried about that one. But coming around here, we're going to give this sort of a wide berth, and then we'll wipe any excess away that we need to. I'm going to wipe just a little bit away there, just one little drop there. Okay, happy with that. Like that, let that sealant squish out. We'll clean that off later. But the tricky part is I got to get the bolts up underneath there somehow without messing up our sealant. Well, there's no really good way to do this, but I've got the board spaced out so I can reach under there a little bit. And we'll see if we can get these bolts started. Okay, I've got them started. Snug them up just a little bit, but we still want to be able to move this so we can get those gears meshed. All right, here's what it looks like underneath. You can also see right in there, you can see the venturi. So that looks good. None of that sealant got squished down into that hole, so that's one way to verify that. All right, let's go ahead and get this aligned, and then we can cinch down those bolts. That looks pretty good right there. I don't think we're going to get any better than that. A nice engagement with the teeth, and it still moves freely. All right, I've got those bolts down there snugged up. We'll see if anything changed. If not, then I'll go ahead and cinch them up for good. And don't forget to install the pickup tube before you put the gas tank together and with the gasket and everything else. We're just going to reuse the old one because it's still in decent shape. And the end with the ball valve on it is also in good condition. You hear that ball rattle around in there, that's what you want to hear. So this pipe gets threaded into that carburetor venturi down in there. And this gets threaded onto the other end of the of the pipe there, and that's all there is to it. Cinch this down with a pair of pliers ever so gently so it's tight, and then we can go ahead and get the gasket and put the two halves together. Of course, you can make your own gasket for this fuel tank, but I'm just going to use the one that came in the kit. I'm going to apply sealant to this surface and sealant to this surface, and we'll sandwich the gasket in the middle. All right, so these are the bolts that hold the top piece to the fuel tank. And you can tell if your bolts are original or not because the original ones have a number 30 on the head. So again, there are 5 of these bolts. One is slightly longer than the other 4. So I'm making the assumption that it goes in here because there's that little tab off the cover plate that it goes through. I don't know if that's correct or not, but that's my assumption at this point. All right, that is good. And I put these on here just to check our mesh one more time. I'm very happy with that. That looks great. So now I'm going to mask everything up and give the engine 1 or 2 more coats of the green paint. I do really like this color, and I believe that is pretty darn close to the original color. Dark hunter green. Although I don't consider this a true restoration because I am taking some liberties with the paint scheme on some of the other parts, and I'll show you those when we get them put on. So get this painted up. We'll let it really thoroughly dry for maybe a day or 2. That will also give all the sealant sufficient time to set up and cure. All right, I've got it all masked up. I'm glad I put a coat of paint on everything before I assembled it to this point because you would never get paint like on the bottom of that manifold, for example, or the bottom of the cylinders up in there. So that was a good thing to get done. Now we'll spray everything in its entirety, and we'll just touch up a couple of these other parts as well, and we'll be ready for final assembly. All right, it's about 24 hours later. The paint is all nice and dry. I made myself a couple of new feet for the motor to sit on, and I've got it all bolted down and secure, so it sits really nice and flat. The paint turned out pretty good. We'll get it out in the sunlight here and we'll really be able to see it shine. But now I'm going to begin the final assembly process. So I'm not really sure where to start first. So I think I'll start with the air intake tube and we'll go from there. Instead of painting this, I thought it would look nice to polish it. It's the original one, so it's a little bit dinged up here and there, but I like the way it turned out. I think it'll look nice offset the paint. And at the base of this, we're just going to put a little bit of gas oil sealant because this needs to be airtight down here as it goes into the block. If you do suck air through this little hole and around this tube, you won't have proper vacuum and you won't have a proper air fuel mix either. As far as lining this thing up, we're just going to get it in the way it was. That this bend here was at the bottom and sort of upright like that. Stick it in just like that. And remember, there's a set screw. All right, I've got the excess sealant wiped off and got it cleaned up. And we'll put the cap on the end. All right, I think that looks pretty nice. All right, we'll put on the rear pulley and I guess the entire foot pedal mechanism now. This goes on first. And remember, it has a hole for this split pin that goes through the end of the crankshaft here, so there's no reason to put oil on the inside of this because it doesn't spin, it just stays fixed on the shaft. And there's nothing that goes in between this and this. All right, I've got that in there. I've got it split a little bit on the end. Okay, I'll put the balls in here next and then put the gear on. Do not put grease or oil on these balls. They need to stay dry so they can roll freely in there. That's the whole idea. I'm gonna put just a couple drops of oil inside this guy. And so it's basically just enough to line the inside of it. There's not enough that's going to drip down inside and get on the balls. And I think we can just set this down on top. Yep. And then this clip goes here, and then we're done with that. Well, that little clip took me probably 20 minutes to get on there. I finally figured out a good way to do it. I just found a socket with the same diameter and I held it on the top and whacked it on with a hammer, and that went on pretty easily that way. So just took me a while to think of it, but we got her on there. All right, see if it works. Yep, locks one way and spins freely the other way. Very good. All right, let's get this foot pedal on. All right, the little pin goes in with the groove towards the engine, so it slides in from back to front, and then this clip goes on the back to retain it. One side of this spring goes in this hole. The other end of the cotter pin and spring goes down in this little hole right here in this cover. Okay, goes on the end like that. Oh yeah, we need this little bracket here and this set screw here, and then we're done. All right, I've got that little bracket on and installed, and the cover is on. We just need to tighten this little set screw here, and then we can test it. All right, it's all cinched down, and I think we've got it. Spring feels like it has pretty good tension. Before I put the spark plugs in, I'm going to put just a little bit of oil down each cylinder. Of course, I oiled the pistons and cylinders when I was assembling it, but we'll just give it a little bit more for good measure. All right, I think it's time for the backing plate and the Magneto assembly. These little tabs right here go on at the 6 o'clock position, and they fit over that little nub right there. All right, we've got it all the way against the housing, And we just need to tighten that set screw down to keep the whole thing from, you know, vibrating and wiggling. All right, next is the timing collar, and you can't put this on the wrong way if you're not careful. All right, that's the back side. There's no lettering or markings on it of any kind. And that's the front side, and it has some markings. It's got an arrow there and some numbers or letters or whatever over here. And it's got a keyway in there, so it can only go on one way on the shaft. We've got the key inserted onto the shaft, and hopefully we can just push this timing collar up on there all the way. You want to set the point gap to 20 thousandths. I've already done that using a feeler gauge, and you want to just loosen up this screw right there until the foot here of the upper points rides on this cam, and then you spin the motor around and watch for the high and low points, and on the high point you adjust it to 20 thousandths. It's as simple as that. And then you tighten the screw back down. All right, this wavy washer goes on next, and it's also got a notch, so it goes right over the keyway all the way up like that. And at this point we are ready to put the flywheel on. Just line up the notch on the flywheel with the key on the crankshaft and push it on. That compression feels really good. No end play at all. I guess we can put the spark plug wires on at this point. All right, let's put our little muffler on here. I do have new lock washers on these bolts. All right, I've got a new gasket on the fuel tank cap, and that reminded me I forgot to check one thing. If we look down in there, you see that little pinhole? That is the breather for the fuel tank because there's no breather on the lid. If that isn't clear, the motor will eventually stop running because it will be sort of like if you're trying to suck through a straw with your finger on the bottom of it. Let's get a guitar string through there. I did check that to make sure it was open before I painted it, but not after. And that's so small that paint could have easily gotten in there. So let me just do that one last thing. All right, we've got the guitar string all the way in there, and if she wasn't before, she's clear now. There. Well, I forgot one thing, so I had to remove the flywheel again. And I just wanted to put a little dab of grease on the timing cam where the point's right on it. You don't want that completely dry because those two things make contact all the time. So I did that, got the flywheel back on. And you can see the flywheel, I polished the center area and then just cleaned up the rest of it. Kind of the same thing as the air intake. I thought that polishing it would look nice and give it a good offset with the paint. So you can't call this a restoration because it is not the original, paint color scheme, but I really like it. I like the polished look against the paint. So the last thing I want to do is get these brand new decals installed, and then we'll try to fire it up. All right, I've got the decals installed. I'm not 100% sure this is how they were installed from the factory, so if you're gonna do one, do research on yours before you stick them on. Okay, I've let the engine sit overnight again. That way the sealant we put around the air intake tube and this governor plug have both had time to set up, but we don't yet know if we have spark. I put a new coil in it, new condenser, dressed up the old points. You know, I just want to make sure that I actually wired it up correctly and that everything is working. Oh yeah, nice, big, bright, healthy spark there. All right, it's time to mix up the oil and the gas. What you need is a precision measuring device like I've got here. I measured and marked a line up to 24 ounces there in this container. I filled it up to 24 ounces with non-ethanol gas. So on the very first video, after I purchased this engine, I got it running and I used some modern two-stroke Valvoline oil. So I've been doing a lot of research since then, and it turns out a lot of people run conventional 30-weight non-detergent four-stroke oil instead of the modern two-stroke stuff. So I'm definitely not an expert on this. I'm not trying to sound like I am. I'm simply trying something different because there's a lot of people that swear by this 30-weight non-detergent four-stroke oil specifically for these Maytag engines. So both of these oils are brand new. This is the modern two-stroke. This is the conventional 30-weight. The modern two-stroke oil is actually quite a bit thinner. And that's actually one of the reasons people recommend this in the Maytag engine. One of the other differences between the two is that the conventional oil has more, I don't know what the correct term would be, impurities. That's probably not quite right. But anyway, it tends to burn a little bit dirtier than the modern two-stroke oil does. So it may smoke a little bit more than the two-stroke oil. Not sure, haven't tried it yet. We're gonna find out real soon. So again, I'm not saying that this is the way everybody should do it. All I'm doing is conducting an experiment here. We tried the modern two-stroke oil first, and now we're gonna try this conventional 30-weight non-detergent. Well, I think that was a very successful first run and first startup. It starts much easier than it did before. I didn't even have to use the foot pedal. You saw me just spin it over by hand with the flywheel a few times, and she came to life. I think it runs much more consistently. It sounds very healthy. It even seems a little quieter to me. Nothing is leaking. I think I might have to put a little muffler guard on it down here because, you know, it sprays just sort of residual mist and some of it ends up landing on the wood here. Might just put a little deflector on there to keep our wood nice and clean. So I guess we'll wrap this project up. Thanks everybody for watching. As always, this was a fun project for me. I got to learn something new. And at the end of the day, I have a nice little motor here.